In Part 1 of our census tutorial, we examined the 1930 census data for our veteran, Frank Savina. The census provided helpful information about the Savina family and allowed us to better understand Frank's childhood and upbringing. It's important to analyze each census available for your veteran. Having more than one census record enables us to see change over time. We'll examine the 1950 census next to understand how Frank's family and circumstances changed after he reached adulthood. Keep in mind that publicly available U.S. census records only go up to 1950. The government waits 72 years to release each decade's census records to protect the personal information of the living. When opening a new document or record on Ancestry, it's helpful to open the record in a new tab. Opening the 1950 census in a new tab allows us to switch back and forth between the two census records and compare data easily. Right away, we can see that much has changed for Frank in the 20 years since the 1930 census. Frank is now 28 years old and married. Frank was just a boy in 1930, but in 1950 he's listed as the head of his household, and this is an important piece of information. To be the head of a household means that Frank had a responsibility to look after and provide for the other members of his household. The head of household was not always the most senior person in a family, but rather the person who cultural norms dictated is responsible for the family. This is true in Frank's case, as his mother is also in the home, yet not listed as the head of household. While Lovey is the Savina family's matriarch, in 1950s America, Frank is considered the head of the family and is accountable for the care and safety of other household members. We'll look more closely at all the residents of the Savina home in a moment, but first, let's finish our analysis of Frank's census data. The Savinas were living in the town of Cole in Harrison County, West Virginia in 1950. By referencing the 1930 census, we can see that the family have moved from Bridgeport to Cole. Frank was no longer living in the home he was raised in, but the Savina family has lived in the same region for the last 20 years. Though the census doesn't tell us whether Frank owned or rented his home in 1950, we do know that the family were not living on a farm and did not own acres of land. To top it off, Frank had steady employment and worked for the government. Now let's see who else made up the Savina family and what we can learn from their census information. The first person listed below Frank is his wife, Mary Savina. Mary's occupation is listed as other, yet she is also listed as not having worked the past week, not being employed, and not seeking employment. Further below, more data shows that Mary was not earning a traditional income or a supplemental income. So, was Mary working? Why is her occupation listed as other? Mary wasn't employed outside the home, but would have been considered a homemaker. Mary's domestic labor should not be overlooked, as her work within the home kept the family fed, clothed, and healthy. Mary hadn't always been a homemaker. She had employment prior to her marriage. This aligns with the social and cultural conventions of the time. As a single woman, Mary would have been expected to work, but after marriage, it was common for American women to leave the workforce and labor within the home. Finally, to round out our picture of Mary, we see that she completed her 12th year of school. Now, let's take a closer look at Frank's mother, Lovey. What has changed for Lovey since 1930, and what can that tell us of the larger Savina family? The first important information to note is that Lovey has had at least 2 more children since 1930. Census takers differentiate between different nuclear families within a single residence by listing children directly beneath their parents, as seen here with Lovey and her daughters Geneva and Norna. Lovey's marital status has changed since 1930. She and Frank's father, Jim, separated. This separation explains why Lovey and her daughters are living with Frank in 1950. It's also important to note that Lovey is not widowed. While we cannot know from the census what kind of relationship Jim had with his children, we can presume he is still alive. Lovey is listed as keeping house, just as she was in 1930. Lovey's daughter Geneva is 17 years old and is also listed as keeping house. So Geneva worked alongside her mother and sister-in-law to perform domestic duties. The final member of the Savina household is 14-year-old Norna. Once we click her name, we can see from the suggested records that her name was either misspelled or mistranscribed. Her name is actually Norma. It's important to remember that the transcription software used by Ancestry doesn't always read cursive writing accurately. Be sure to look at the primary source, the census itself, to double-check the information given. Census data notes the most recent grade that has been fully completed. Norma has completed the 6th grade, meaning that she was in the 7th grade, and she was actively attending school. Much has happened in Frank's life between 1930 and 1950. Frank is now one of 7 Savina children and a married man himself. Following his parents' separation, his mother and 2 youngest sisters came to live with him and his wife. He worked full-time for the government and was the sole conventional source of income for his household of 5. Though the Savina family have moved, they haven't moved far. This demonstrates the strong and meaningful ties that Frank and his family might have felt for their community, or a lack of economic opportunity to move elsewhere. Hopefully, this example has given you some ideas for how to track your veteran's personal journey through census records. Remember, you can also use census records for your veterans' parents to learn more about their backgrounds. Have fun searching.